Andrew Luber, how are you, sir?
I'm doing good. I'm doing good. How are you?
I'm doing fine. I'm doing fine. Just getting all the emails and everything sorted for the wedding this weekend. I certainly enjoyed our conversation the other evening. So thank you for that, sir. That was a real delight.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for bringing in like new terms for me to think about I guess, the meta issue and
Mm,
how to map that out and uh, how to make a real choice. I think it
mm,
has to deal with real choice in a very interesting way, and just like a different. To me, it made me think. There's so many different possible ways of alterologies like
mm,
that I'm not even aware of, and just the meaning of the meaning story is. I
mm.
think that's the term you
Yes,
coined. The meaning story brings out the possibility of to me just like an infinite amount of alterologies. Like that's one of the consequences,
yep,
and it uniquely provides such meaning to alterologies in the sense that as an individual, you can create your own alterology, and that's how meaningful it is.
that's
So,
right.
thank you for that.
Oh, well, thank you. And I also should tell you that I spoke last night with Thomas Wynn, who's a tremendous Heideggerian scholar and thinker. I think you'd love to meet him. And we had a
Oh,
fantastic. And another thing that actually came up, and I've always one way that I've kind of understood some of Heidegger is in terms of the hip hop cipher, where if you get certain people in a certain circle, you can have this flow state of these different things emerge. But
mhm.
they have to like condition themselves with the ability, bring themselves with a certain openness, and then you can have kind of the hip hop sort of the free verse sort of arise. And it's kind of funny because often in hip hop ciphers too, there can be kind of like an ethic where if you have a preset lyric that you bring to the discussion, then that's almost like violating it. You're supposed to be there off the dome. And my wonderful friend Bernard Hankins and I would talk about this. He's a tremendous spoken word poet, and on this kind of idea that you're supposed to like let emerge out of the cipher something happen, and that's kind of like being unveiling itself, and it's kind of a way to think about creating. Oh, Ethan Nelson and Dimitri, good to see you, sir. How you create these kind of conditions where something can emerge, and then you can think
Right.
of like the meaning story as kind of bringing together the elements to create this. Ethan Nelson, it's
I,
good to see you, my friend. What a delight! This guy's
Nice to
beautiful.
see you.
It's good to see you, Ethan. It's a treat. But it's very interesting to think about kind of the hip hop cipher as a condition to have this emergence of a kind of being, a kind of flow, something kind of unexpected that comes out of it, and this sort of unveiling of being that can kind of
I,
happen.
I think you and Dr. Lass have a great rhythm. Like when you guys get into it, I feel that it's like coming from the same place, but from a different angle in a little bit, and it's very compatible.
Mm.
So I think you guys definitely possess that. What was the phrase? A
Cypher, hip hop freak.
cipher.
Yeah,
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 yeah. I
yeah.
like that. Where you riff back and forth very well. I really enjoy that. So.
Well, I've been thinking too how Dialogos, John Vervaeke, Circling, Guy
Hmm.
Senstock, who I recently spoke to, Cypher, all of these things seem to be on the same gradient. I'm not saying they're the same, but they have a similar sort of emergent property where you don't necessarily know ahead of time what's going to happen, but you also have to kind of face your anxiety and be willing to step into the Dialogos or step into the Cypher or step into the Circling or an unexpected experience, and how there's something about that of which is a necessary precondition for a certain kind of human being, a certain sort of being to unveil itself that cannot unveil itself in any other circumstance. But the cipher, I think, is an interesting example because there's an anxiety you have to face. There's a vulnerability you have to be willing to go through. Because what if you step in the cipher and you're an idiot? You can't think of what to say. Likewise, when you step into a dialogos conversation or a circling, like Guy Senstock, what if like some emotional difficulty comes up? And I think this kind of lays with Heidegger, because in Heidegger, there's a certain existential anxiety that one must face, must go through to get to the
Right.
place where being can unveil itself. And
And
so
if
it's
I could
it.
just,
Please.
sorry, if I could just add with the Heidegger thing, I feel like if you don't have enough thinking, like if you don't dwell enough, you can like you'll get caught up or paused within that dialogos, or
Yep.
if you're not completely like concentrating within your own thoughts, like uh, regrettably, in the one net conversation, I was like out and about, and like I was like half there, half here a little bit, and like that's not good for thinking. So like you
Mm.
completely have to be within yourself. So like I totally get why he would go to the forest, so he can really, really be within himself and see what comes out. But yeah.
Oh, and what's interesting too, and it brings to mind some of the talks I had with the wonderful Mr. Ethan Nelson right there, who has a wonderful being conscious, wonderful Substack, wonderful channel, beautiful soul. And it makes me think too how like if you're in a cipher and you're thinking too hard about what you're going to say next, like you're in this kind of, Heidegger warned against that technological thinking, like if you're too thoughtful as opposed to letting being disclose itself and responding to it, then you mess up. You like fall into anxiety. Likewise, I used to do magic tricks on the street, Secret Life of Daniel. And if you think too hard about the magic trick and am I doing it right, you mess it up because it doesn't flow. You got to be very slick when you're doing magic tricks. And wow, I'm really telling you my secret life. And if you are too aware of the magic trick and where they're looking and what they're doing, you completely lose it. And so it's interesting to think of this thinking like you do all this work to be able to enter into the cipher. But then when you enter into the cipher, it's almost like you have to leave it behind. Right? Like it reminds me of, and I brought this up with the great Mr. Wynn, it's like Isaiah Berlin was very famous for writing tons and tons of notes before he gave like lectures and presentations, and then he would throw them all away. Like he'd write all this stuff down and never take them on stage. But there was something about that work that got it into his system that then allowed him to flow. So it was a necessary step, but the throwing the notes away was also a necessary step. That's what's very strange. Like you have to do it, but then let it go. And the letting go is part of the practice. And that kind of makes me think of philosophy, where philosophy is you're doing all this work, there's all this work, but then you have to kind of let it go and go into your everydayness, return to your common life, step into the cipher, step into, and that's where we've been talking so much with like Javier and different people about the person at the store. And it's interesting to think about this letting go as a necessary step to actually live an embodied life, and so that being can disclose itself. And then what's interesting to think as well, the challenge seems to be, as we see in Heidegger kind of going into the Black Forest to kind of let things unveil themselves per se into a clearing, it almost is like today in this stage of the meaning story, the crisis is that we now have to learn how to actually have being disclose itself while not in a forest, like in civilization, around other people. And that makes me think of kind of the Hegel element of here, like
storify your experience.
That's exactly right, which is very difficult in a social order. It's one thing for me to say, figure out how to have being unveil itself to me when I'm alone or when I'm in a forest or I'm around people who think like me. It's an entirely different matter to figure out how to condition myself to be the kind of person that can do it while still in the social order or is around other people. So Mr. Nelson, I should let you know that Mr. Luber and I were speaking the other evening, and we thought about framing the meaning crisis. Another way to kind of think about the meaning crisis is actually in terms of the meaning story. And what we mean by that is that history has had a rising action of learning how to create meaning, religion, philosophy, society. But then you had an inciting incident like totalitarianism, the religious bigotry, all of these different things. And so now we're at the climax point, the crisis point, which is the meaning crisis, where we have to figure out how to have meaning without resorting to old ways. Like I've spoken to you before about meaning crisis as a sign of hope. So the climax, and you see the climax of the crisis always entails a kind of choice, like a choice where the protagonist can never go back from. So now we have to figure out how to choose a source of meaning that doesn't fall back into old ways, and that is actually sustainable as well. So it's like, the crisis, the meaning crisis can then be situated within a meaning story that you see in history, where the question is, what are we going to do now? What's going to be the new source of meaning? And I think this gets into, and I'll let you speak, Mr. Nelson, this gets into like Hegel, Heidegger, all these different conversations, intrinsic motivation, beauty, all of those different things. So that was a framing we had the other day.
Dude, that's amazing. I love to hear the meaning crisis stuff come back. As you were speaking, I was really getting this sense, and I kind of moved away from calling it the meaning crisis, but I've been like kind of also in the space a bit, and it feels to me like, with we're at this point where we kind of threw everything out. Like we can't go back to the old way. So everything got thrown out. And now like there's kind of like an air of like nihilism and like meaninglessness that comes with like throwing out all the old ways because they didn't work. And what I'm really interested in is like, what are the things that we threw out that we actually shouldn't have thrown out? It's not that it's like we can't go back to this kind of totalitarian religious like fundamentalist viewpoint, but there's something in that we threw out that we shouldn't have. What is that? That's what I'm really interested in these days.
I think that that's absolutely critical, kind of this looking back. I completely agree with that, Mr. Luber.
So within the meaning story, like mapping where we are in the grand story, so to speak, I would make an argument that we're actually approaching the midway point of the story, and that the inciting incident has occurred a long time ago. So like, to me, the inciting incident starts with Descartes and the thinking leading all the way up to Heidegger, where it's seeing how we were incited upon, but there was another aspect of the story that we weren't aware of, which caused conflict. So which caused the second act, so to speak, to progress. So now we're at the point where we're within the second act and we're able to look back on ourselves, to kind of talk about what Ethan just said, to look back on ourselves, to then now say, okay, I'm starting to see where the conflict is coming from. Now I'm going to try to make a claim or do something, an action that copes with the fact that there's conflict, essentially, like a coping. And in that coping, it's like almost like a new world is now being bestowed onto the protagonist, the human being here. And what that will result in, to me, would be in the climax. And this is just a claim. Like, we could be in the climax. You know, it's hard to tell the mapping of the story here, because I think people can choose different inciting incidences from a universal level, because I don't think it's just Descartes is the main inciting incident. But yeah, I just wanted to throw out that claim.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And when I say, you know, the inciting incident, especially if we're talking about a meaning story that's this very big history, big scale thing, it's not going to be just one little thing. It will be a collection of developments in the zeitgeist and different things like that. And you know, and what you said, Mr. Nelson, it also makes me think of the genius of Hegel. And I have a Hegel quote, I have a Hume quote, a Hegel quote, and different things in honor of Mr. Dimitri here, who, by the way, Dimitri does extraordinary work on his channel on Hegel. He's got the Sons of Nietzsche, all those different things that are tremendous, and he's braving the science of logic, a good man. But it's funny because for Hegel, you can't just sort of say, oh, here's our current point. Like, you have to tarry with the negative. You have to go through the stages of development, even if, like in the phenomenology of spirit, you're basically realizing what's always already the case. Like, you're always already operating according to the full phenomenological journey, you know, to use that language from Dr. Last. But you're not the same if you just know that, as opposed to work through that. So you need to work through that, and you actually have a different kind of being if you work through that, as opposed to just know that. And it kind of makes sense, right? If I were to say, if I were to tell you, oh, I was once a magician, you know, that's not the same as me like showing you the process of doing card tricks and working through all of that. You have the same information, but you don't have the same understanding, I guess you could say. Like, you still, so you have to work through that. And there indeed is something about looking back at religion. You know, for example, what is it that religion gave people? What did it do? I was recently talking with Jason James and Arthur Gordon about risk, ritual, and relevance, and how there's something about a religion was a good concentration of providing all three of those. You know, you could go to church and maybe God doesn't exist. There's relevance, because if God exists, going to church matters. And there's a ritual, because you do it every single week. And with those three characteristics, and I know Dr. Vervaeke will talk about a ecology of practices, ritual, and different things like that. But it's something where religion understood that humans need those, and that all three of those help people get an understanding of themselves that they found meaningful. Okay, so how does one today say implement risk, ritual, and relevance in a manner that does not fall to the same totalitarianism, for example, or does not lead to certain problematic egotisms? So there's this need to kind of work through what has gone through to understand where we are now, because that could transform our current state. And with that, I'll pass it to whoever would like to speak.
Yeah, I would like to come here. because yesterday Alexander Bard had a talk, and it was called "A Religion That Is Finally a Religion." And of course, Alexander Bard is all, when we talk about religion, it's all about Eastern religion, about outright rejecting Christianity because of the problem with Sutra and Tantra. Now, very short, Sutra, Western religions are sutric, which means that they're based on renouncing drive and desire. So take the Ramadan, for example, or Christian fasting. You're renouncing a drive, and therefore you're becoming also more spiritually mature because you're doing this. Eastern religion have this thing called Tantra, where you're actually using those drives and desires, or the life force itself, the libido, to spiritually mature. Now, a religion that's finally a religion, what is that? Well, I was thinking about that in a, like, what does that mean? What would that mean for Hegel, right? That would mean that the notion of religion corresponds to the object of religion. And the conclusion I've came to is that a religion that's finally a religion is a concrete universal. Or it's like a religion that's really out there in the world. It's not just some idea that some guy in his own room came up with and was like, this is a genius idea. It's something that, Daniel, what you said, it's already there. You know, it's like we're thrown into life, and there's already Christianity. There's these huge traditions of symbols, of narratives, and somehow what we right now call Christianity is a kind of, I mean, it's interesting, right? Because when you say Christianity, you seem to denote a monolith, but when you start researching it, it's so diverse. Like there's so many things in the Bible coming from the Gathas, coming from other traditions. And of course, within Christianity itself, you have Catholicism, Protestantism, all the different Protestant denominations, Orthodoxy. So I basically think like the project I'm working on right now is I'm trying to I'm trying to kind of save Christianity from dualism with Hegel and Nietzsche. And it's super doable because, you know, Nietzsche kind of goes, with Christianity, he goes about it in two ways in general. One way is kind of the way that Bard is doing it, throwing it out the windows, outright rejecting it, saying, oh, this is just worship of the behind world, this is death worship, this is just getting off on your own abstract ideas that have nothing to do with the real world, with their real concrete reality. But then when you read also Sprach Zarathustra, he's constantly using Christian metaphors. He's talking about crucifixion. He's talking about the spirit of heaviness being the devil. He's talking about original sin, and he's rewriting it. So original sin, for example, for Zarathustra, is not the fact that we've eaten from the tree of knowledge, but it's that we have a lack of freuen, which there's no English word for, but it basically means to look forward in excitement. This is the original sin for Zarathustra. So, I mean, I love to think of Nietzsche as a Christian thinker, and I think it's very doable and a very fruitful way to think Nietzsche, actually, to take him up as a Christian.
No, I appreciate that very much. And Mr. Javier Rivera, good timing, by the way, because he just had a great talk with Dr. James Simpkins, where he made the point that basically, like, when you engage in Christianity, like everyone they mean something different by God to every person you talk to, and then everyone prays alone in the room. So there's like, not only is there denominations and then different major religions, in a sense, there's like thousands, if not millions, of personal relationships that constitute their own religion, because no two people mean the same thing when they say God. I thought that was a very interesting point. And there's a lot of truth to that, because even like, say, Catholics who are, say, they even identify as the same kind of Catholic, a conservative Catholic or something, can differ on what the sacraments mean to them, even if they point to the same God. So it's interesting to think that there is, you know, you're never able to talk about a single thing. And yet it's funny how language almost forces us to use monolithic language that's applying that. That's where you always have to, that's kind of the knowing you have to fail as you think kind of Hegel move. You have to know that that's always going to be part of the process. But it's very easy to would forget that. So the point you're getting at is very good. And indeed, a lot of, religion can be pull one out of the world and have that effect. And the question becomes, does it have to be? What's a religion that doesn't do that? What's a religion that stays in the concrete are interesting questions. And I'll pass it on to Mr. Luber. And
I have a question really that has to do with religion. So a religion that's finally a religion. That's a very interesting comment, because to me, I'm reading Nishitani right now. So to me, that like screams Nishitani, and I just wonder, is the religion that's finally a religion, is that basically just suggesting the dimension in which a possible religion can be a religion, or is it addressing something different where it's just like, no, once a religion becomes a religion, there's this ultimate religion. It has nothing to do with the actual like arising of the religion, but the actualization, the consequent of the religion existing. So is the emphasis of that notion in the like precondition of a religion, or the actual consequent of the religion, would be my question.
That's a huge question. And to hark back to what we were talking about before, there is this thing happening in history that we have these paradigms and we have certain religions, and somehow, to simplify it, people feel at home there, but they start feeling less and less at home in there. So they throw out the baby with the bathwater. They throw it out, but with that throwing out, they also throw out something that, to what Ethan said, we throw out something that we should have never thrown out in the first place. But I think that, like, it would be interesting to ask the question of like, what were the first Christians doing? Because I don't think it would have anything to do with what we call Christianity right now. That would be, I don't think that's possible.
I feel like Heidegger would just say to that there's no way the first Christians would be doing what we're doing now, because the world's completely different. The meaning in their world that makes them a Christian at that time is different than this world, in which the meaning, how that individual relates to the world, is just a completely different level. But I think at least Nishitani, and like, this is just like a knee-jerk thought, I feel like Nishitani is talking about the preconditions to religion. That like, to think about the preconditions to religion is actually what makes religion. And it's like a little paradoxical. Like, the point in which a religion becomes a religion, that dimension is where religion is. But it's like in that becoming state. It's like very confusing to me. So I'm like trying to come to grips. It's like he's talking about something that seems to be not tangible at all, but that not tangibleness is exactly what makes it existing and make it like this entity that is very important to the human condition.
Yeah, I think Javier raised his hand first, but mine's really quick, so I can just say it really quick. It's just, when I hear like the religion that's finally a religion, what I'm hearing is that like all the religions attempted to accomplish a certain thing, and then in the process went sideways. And so what is a religion that gets back to the thing that religions were attempting to do and actually accomplishing it, rather than leading into dogma and all these other things? That I just wanted to frame that as how that was coming up for me. And I want to hear Javier next.
I actually know that he raised his hand first. I just wanted to hear your voice first, Mr. Ethan Nelson. But with that, Mr. Javier Rivera.
Oh, well, thanks. No, I think Ethan makes a good point here too. I mean, hearing like what religion that's not a religion, it's always like, a little concerning, because it's like, what kind of standards are we using to judge, to determine, what it was. I think even the notion of like the failing of something is, kind of standard that we are imposing on the framework. But of course, maybe religion was supposed to fail. You know, but I think, was it Dimitri, right? He said that, you know, the Christians before, right? The early Christians. Well, I mean, if we think about like Muhammad and, you know, Jesus Christ and all these other like prominent figures that sort of like started the religions, right? What's interesting about them is that actually they never like claimed a religion, really. They claimed a message, right? I think that's what's fascinating, right? They claimed a message. And they didn't really identify anything. They just said that they believe in like a God. And then there's these, you know, principles. But other than that, I mean, there is no identification. So I think this is why I stress the concept of a personal relation, because if I'm going to entertain the idea that that we don't have a, you know, religion that was never religion, or, you know, finally let's get to a religion that actually is, it does seem like personal relation is something that never was cultivated, right? You see all these people sort of debating dogmas and theology and so on, but you don't have people cultivating actual personal relationships with the thing that they're arguing about. You know, I think that's probably the most important thing, and I think this is like where mystics come in, because mystics can be so subversive, but they're subversive not because they're disobeying the system of dogma or whatever, they're like a threat to dogma, is because actually they have cultivated a personal relationship with the deity itself, and that's why it becomes threatening. But then again, you have to understand that these mystics seem to have a more concrete relationship than the people that are arguing in theology. They're arguing abstract things. And I think it's important to argue abstract things. I think there's definitely a necessity, but at the same time, I think we've given too much precedence over that. And it seems like even when I was talking to my last interview with Dr. James Simkin here, you know, the Bible itself, in terms of like literary language, is actually very abstract, right? We talk about Moses. The Bible just goes straight to Moses splitting the sea, right? It doesn't tell you anything of a concrete experience, like how the people felt, you know, what it was like, the experience of the actual sea splitting, right? You don't get any of that. You get simply the sea split, Pharaoh drowns with his entourage, basically, right? Like that's it. Now I think what was it, Luber? Yeah, Luber talked about Nishitani. I've been very much reading Nishida, the, you know, sort of the one of the teacher figures for Nishitani, and it does seem like actually both Nishitani and Nishida kind of emphasize this idea that religion is almost strictly on the individual basis. Now, I want to clarify what I mean by individual, because this is going to be very important. Actually, I'm probably gonna have to bring up Buber, unfortunately, because what do we mean by individual is actually that when we're talking about God, it's this or mutual determination between you and God that actually defines you as an individual. So I think it's very important that we understand that when we speak of individual, you can have this co-determination where you have God and you mutually determining each other, but of course, that's always going to be via the community of your experience with others, things, animals, nature, so on. So this is what, you know, I get on my understanding of like actually being an individual is sort of this mutual determination on where you see the other as other, but then all at the same time you find the other in you, and vice versa. So there is that notion of individual that I just want to clarify, because it's not like you know, this notion that we have in the modern age where it's like, yeah, I'm just this individual person, I have my own opinions and so on. But yeah.
First, Andrew, the emergence of religion. Now, usually we ask, to put it in Hegelese immediately, we ask the question, what is substance, the absolute truth, God, the absolute, the thing that abides, that's eternal? What is it for us? What is it for subject? Zizek has a proposal for us. It's to ask the opposite question. What is subject for substance? So an example here. Two examples actually. One example is that you know, there was this one tribe in Brazil, and they knew that, you know, these white people were very dangerous. They had this knowledge, but they never actually came into contact with them. And once the civilization tried to contact them, and they painted themselves in red. Now imagine being one of these people in that tribe. Like, you're coming into contact with aliens, basically. Like, that's how aliens would be for us, you know, like we are the aliens when we're coming to them. Another more example that's more in regards to religion. So we can ask the question, what is the human for animals? What is the human for animals? And like, of course, this is maybe a bit ridiculous, but humans, we have houses, we have churches, we have stoves, we have clothes, we have all these things that basically don't seem like they have grown out of this natural world, but seem to come from another transcendental kind of realm, from some kind of alien world that has come down. And this is basically the instantiation of religion as something coming from the none-other. Like, there is this kind of, yeah, how do you call it, like this, the transcendence of God that we bring down to earth in concrete manners. Now, in regards to the personal relation to God, I think that this was all what the Protestant Reformation was about. Because Luther was accusing the Catholic Church of, you know, it's not about the personal salvation, about faith anymore. It's about buying all that stupid shit and whatever. So we need to go back and make the Bible the authority. Now, what's interesting here is that Alexander Barth, you can use his theory to critique this gesture of the Protestant Reformation, because there's another problem you get with making the text an authority. You know, Islam itself had huge problems with that. You know, with eventually after Muhammad, you had the Sunnis and the Shias, and they have different ideas about how this exactly works. So I don't think essentially that you can, at the end of the day, have a text as the authority. I don't know, Protestants right now have only the Bible as the but yeah, it's a very real thing that they have realized this, and they have wanted to go back in this to the personal relationship in history with the Reformation.
No, thank you, Dimitri. Mr. Ebert, always a pleasure to see you, sir. I hope you're doing well, and some lucky individual is going to win a spot in the Science of Logic class coming up with Mr. Cadell last, thanks to Mr. Ebert over there. Good man, good man. And I think this is a fascinating question when we talk about a religion that's finally a religion based on the parallax conversation that I look forward to watching. And it's interesting, are we talking about a certain precondition of a religion, like it gets the right precondition, or is it the right practice that is occurring within the religion that would constitute that you now have a real religion? And this is kind of an interesting question, because that does get into the notion of metric. What is the metric? You know, if, for example, let's say that you had people believe a lot of Gnostic nonsense that's very otherworldly and very bad, but for some reason it results in them treating people nicely or something, or say being a good person. Well, does that mean it's a successful religion? You know, maybe the precondition is very problematic, but the practice could be good. And last week we said that, that the practical is actually more real than the technical in some Hegelian sense. You know, you would say technically two people in the dance are not one, but in practice, they actually have a kind of flow state where they are one. So practically one, even if there is technically distinction, right? So there's a question on a religion that is truly a religion. Is it on the metric of the technical, where it's say Gnostic technically, but actually practically for some strange reason, it results in people say being more worldly. Maybe actually they say, oh, sex points to the divine and the divine is otherworld. And the only way I can access the other world is say to engage in sexual activity. So then they revere sex. I'm not saying, I'm just making a hypothetical example there, right? You would say, okay, well, practically they become more concrete precisely because they follow these Gnostic theories, right? So what would be the metric by which you determine if a religion is actually finally a religion or if it's a concrete religion? Is a religion concrete, if we're talking in a Hegelian sense or just in general? Is it concrete based on the practice or based on the ideas that the religion is following? Because it's very interesting with human beings. Sometimes actually you get paradoxical results where precisely because people believe things that are the things that people believe can actually manifest in the opposite practice of what you would think, right? And so what would be the metric that one would need to follow in that circumstance? But with that, I'll give it back to Mr. Javier Rivera.
Yeah, that's a great question, Daniel. How do we determine like the metrics? I think that's always like, I don't know. I think that's why like the whole point of actually making multiple, schools of thought within the religion itself is always sort of like necessary. It almost seems like it's called for now. I don't even think that's happening anymore. I think maybe that's why we're in the predicament that we're in. Not only do we need people thinking, what a new religion would be like, but we also need people thinking, what would a new sort of section of religion would look like. Now, what's hard right now, obviously, is because, now we have like, what is it? Like a sort of ecumenical Christianity now, right? Like you can go so far as non-denominational, right? And that seems to be like the very cusp of like, all right, this is as far as we can go, boys. Like, in terms of like splitting. But I don't know. I think I would challenge that. I think, I think at that point we just sort of like just stop thinking about how we, relate to these current religions and so on. I think that's probably one of the issues. I'm pretty sure it's more complicated than that. And also what I mean by personal relation, I definitely don't mean, Dimitri, at least I don't mean, taking the text as authority. Now, I do agree that would be some of the factors that sort of contributed for the Reformation. But again, what I mean by individual would be actually to use the text to see the other, right? But it seems like the Reformation probably didn't succeed in that and actually seeing the other. Instead, they blocked the other by using the authority of the text itself. So that creates an issue. Actually, to Daniel's point, I actually think the history of Japan is actually the beginning of when Buddhism got to Japan is actually a very interesting example where the Japanese actually didn't have any like theological concepts to go off of. Like they had very little. It was very much the practice itself. They just started meditating, worshiping the Buddha before they actually started getting more texts from China and Korea to, actually start developing their schools of thought. So it's very fascinating that actually once Buddhism entered Japan, they had the inverse relationship. It wasn't anything like dogmatic schools of concepts or anything. It was just strictly the practice itself that sort of allowed Buddhism to enter Japan. And then the schools of thought sort of developed later on. I mean, this also seems to be a trend with Islam as well, before they started getting like, different schools of thought for them, schools of law specifically. But also, it gets a lot more complicated, right? I mean, we're talking about, okay, there's a text and, people are arguing about the text and so on. But if we take the history of Islam, actually, a lot of the problems rooted from the fact that there were certain tribes that wanted to have power within the religion itself. And that became a lot of the issues for civil war. You know, and just to complicate it, right? If you're talking about the Sunnis and Shias, right? The Shias think that the authority should always come from Muhammad's family, right? But if you think about it, his family is so big, he could have a cousin, then have a kid, and you could say, well, that's the prophets of the family, right? Okay, so that actually complicates the whole matter even more, right? That actually becomes one of the biggest issues, right? But if you're already part of the prophet's family, why wouldn't you just say it's your kid next, right? So it complicates it so much. And that's a lot of the problems that actually happened throughout the history of Islam. Before the Shias finally just kind of like solidified their thought and said, look, it has to be directly from Ali and Fatima, the lineage, right? So it's you know, it's excruciatingly more complicated than, you know, what we seem to like grasp half the time when we're talking about, okay, look, there's this text, they say it's the authority, you know, and this is kind of like the departing of it. I mean, I think a lot of the tribal aspects, you know, we start talking about state Buddhism, it gets more complicated, right? Schools start competing for patronage, right? It's everything that we're talking about becomes deeply economical, deeply about power. Religion becomes just this medium to sort of get all those things, really, at this point, right? So yeah, the question, religion, you know, what is religion after religion has sort of failed, I guess. Yeah, it's a good question. Because it almost seems like we have to answer the economical, the tribal, you know, the power hungry situations that religion itself seems to be a medium for. Yeah, I just want to complicate the situation a little more, but just by saying that.
Well, we love complication, Javier, and I'll give it to Luba and then Dimitri. A few things. First, on the question of why interpretation doesn't quite work so well, I think there's a piece we did called "The Protestant Work Ethic is Only Half the Story," which is talking about Weber. And kind of the idea is that for Protestants, you kind of proved your salvation through working very hard, different things like that. I think it's important to realize that when you restrict your religious understanding to the text and you don't allow, you know, there's this big split in Christianity between revelation and reason, for example. So reason is kind of bad and revelation is good. So you should just know the revelation. Here's the problem. To interpret, you have to use reason. So you can't actually make that split between revelation and reason. And if you don't own your reason, you just absorb the zeitgeist of the world, which at that time was capitalism. And then your understanding of the revelation tends to be in line with capitalism. So I think a hermeneutical, I think the paper hopefully makes a case for why, another reason why you see the Protestant work ethic develop as it is aligned with capitalism is precisely because there's not an ownership in Protestantism at that time of the role of hermeneutics, which I think is very important. And Jason, great to see you, my friend. The other thing I will say, Bernard and I, the great spoken word poet, and by the way, he just posted on his YouTube channel, Ethereum, tremendous poem, really, really great. We would always talk about, one of the things we kind of talked about is how religion is in massive trouble if it doesn't become a kind of creating the conditions of a hip hop cipher or something that is kind of attuned to that. With the cipher, and this is like, oh, and Javier, I just spoke with Thomas Wynn last night. It was beautiful. I love that guy. He's really great. And we were talking about the conditions of the hip hop cipher. You know, if you would have just come off on the street and say, what's going on here? Just like a circle of people standing around, right? But if you were to literally say a cipher is just a circle of people standing around, you are missing the full experience of what's going on and kind of the flow and kind of also this vulnerability. These people are here. There's a vulnerability. There's an anxiety. There's a fear. But there's also a certain training that they brought to be able to create off the dome experience of the cipher. And it's interesting how for many people, they would associate that with spiritual, with kind of religion. And they would talk about it as having this kind of movement of the spirit. And it would seem to be a lot of this question of a religion that is actually a religion is the creation of conditions, for one, of which allow that kind of experience that you see in this sort of cipher. But that's going to be, I think, a combination of sutra and tantra, because there are certain, you're going to have trained yourself to be able to do that. There are going to be certain restrictions on your, say, anxiety that you have to face to enter into that, but then you also have to let it go. You have to let it flow so the cipher can operate. So as a reference point, more can be said on this, but I'll hand it to Mr. Mr. Luber and Dimitri. It's interesting to think of the Cypher as kind of pointing to perhaps part of the answer to this question, which may also suggest why particularly Pentecostalism has exploded in America as a Protestant denomination, which I'm not saying is the same as the Cypher, but there might be some at least subconscious understanding that getting to what religion actually needs to be is something closer to that kind of spiritual unleash than it is, say, the following dogma purely. Right. And then, of course, the question becomes the balance, because then arguably the danger of American Pentecostalism is that it has been easily absorbed in extreme movement because it doesn't have enough dogma to stop the zeitgeist coming in and taking over. And actually, that makes me think of Mr. Ebert's talk on Rebel Wisdom, where he was talking about the dangers of the New Age movement and how there could be a dark side to that. I actually think you see a parallel that some respects in American Pentecostalism. So then you have to find that balance. And Javier, a Cypher is in hip hop, where you have a bunch of individuals that will get into a circle and they're like hip hop. They're a free verse off of one another. And it's kind of like a flow state. And it's actually, I think, a very useful metaphor in this context. So with that, I will give it to Mr. Luber, Dimitri, and then Mr. Ebert.
I have to run soon, unfortunately, but I wanted to say, Javier, the last net, what you were proposing about story, and just the questions that you were getting at definitely made me think, and I just wanted to say that I'm appreciative of that. And Ebert just left, but a few net conversations ago, he was talking about art, and it helped me reflect upon art also in a very interesting way, and I just wanted to thank him for that. But I just wanted to leave, I guess, with a few thoughts from what everyone's been talking about with individualism and religion. So to me, I totally get how religion is for the individual, but at the same time, when it's accessible to the individual, it ought to be accessible to another person. So if I have a certain religion, it seems like it should be compatible with anybody else. Like anybody else has the possibility of accessing that religion and it being like a home for them, so to speak. So in that sense, religion has that ability to bring in any other person like me, which is kind of everyone else. So in that sense, what is an individual religion if religion has that component to it where it gathers people in? That like Nishitani talks about, it gathers people in that don't even think about religion. The second they think about it, it's when they, gather people in. So to me, what he's talking about is a real religion in the sense that it allows for self-referencing to occur. So it reminds me of like how Heidegger talks about art and truth, where like when he talks about the church, like what's happening, why it's true, why it's like real art is because everything about the church, once I'm in the church, I'm self-referencing my very existence, like the very why that I'm here. That question is being perpetuated by the art, by the religion, by the, as Daniel puts it, the alterology. So it has to do with the self-referencing component, which to me just screams ontological design. So, sorry. So it's like religion. What's religion's relationship to ontological design? To me, seems to be a fundamental one, because we're always gonna be operating with some kind of religion or lack thereof, and either case is design, it seems. So yeah, I just wanted to ask that question: religion's relationship to ontological design.
Kant, Immanuel Kant, he wrote all these books, and he said that basically what he wanted to do is save faith from reason, from all-encompassing reason, which just eats up everything, and at the end of the day is completely abyssal. So he wanted to put up some limits to our knowing and actually claim that we can never know the absolute truth or thing in itself. I'll just read a response that Hegel had in the Philosophy of Religion, which I think is really is really amazing. Be as perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. If we know nothing of God and God's perfection, how can we know this? How can we become like this? How should this be a commandment for us whose knowledge and will are so limited and oriented throughout only toward appearances, and for whom the truth, and God is the truth, is supposed to remain simply a beyond? With respect to its content, we must regard such a point of view as the last step in the degradation of humanity. Yet at the same time, humanity is all the more arrogant in that it has proved this degradation to be its supreme achievement. I thought it was hilarious. And for Hegel, it's actually the opposite to Kant. God, he says it in the Philosophy of Religion, reason is God for Hegel. And it is a basic fact of Christianity for Hegel that we must be able to know God. Otherwise, how can we become like God? So I see that he left right now, but this is maybe somewhere we connect ontological to design to religion. Now, Xavier, to what you said, you know, in the time of the Reformation, people didn't read the Bible because the Bible was Latin. And in a lot of parishes, they didn't even have Bibles. So they just basically wanted to even know like what's in the Bible and what's our religion about. And it was a very humble and basic move at first. Like Luther didn't want to have a Protestant Reformation. He just wanted to reform the Catholic Church and have it stay true to its Christian core, actually.
So I really like that kind of question on religion as ontological design, and then I'll give it over to Mr. Ebert. And I should note also on that kind of idea that Hegel's getting at, there's this old debate between Karl Barth in one of the church dogmatics where he says something like Aquinas had this notion of the analogy of being, which is that things can be like God. Yes, when we talk about goodness, it's not the same as God's goodness, but it has to be, you know, that it's like it. And, you know, Karl Barth basically says that's the doctrine of the Antichrist. You know, the moment you can even say that lowercase g goodness has anything to do with capital G goodness, you know, it's going to be just a matter of time before you get heresy or whatever. But then a really good theologian came along named Austin Farah, basically making that Hegelian point where he's like, hey, you know, if the lowercase g goodness has nothing to do with God's absolute g goodness, why not say God is cat? You know, it's all random then. There's no connection at all. And basically there has to be some analogy, some sort of connection between our language and what God actually is, or otherwise it's, you know, it's nothing. Now, the danger is that you have an equal sign between lowercase g goodness and uppercase g goodness, as opposed to say a like that is infinitely off. And this is where Austin Farah says, yes, you absolutely need to stress the apophatic. Yes, you absolutely need to stress that there is a very real sense in which God is so much different than your concepts of God that it's almost more accurate to say that God isn't those concepts. But you always must remember that even that apophatic statement is meaningful to you because there is some kind of connection going on there, even if you always have to fight that connection and to never let it become an equal sign to you. And that seems to be this kind of trick that we're describing, this need to have a sort of connection of the terms, but then automatically kind of working to deconstruct it, automatically like working against the way that thought presents things to us. And yet it must present things to us, or otherwise there would be nothing there for us to tarry with. There would be no negativity to tarry with, or something that we need to tarry with. And that seems to be this interesting skill that one needs to develop. But with that, I'll give it to Mr. Ebert. Mr. Ebert, always good to see you, sir. I hope you're doing well.
Good to see you. Good to see you guys. I find myself always it's interesting, meditating on why do I always find myself so disenchanted with talk about re-implementing religion? And why do I find talk about the crisis we're in and the meaning crisis and how to fix it? Why am I so disinterested in this? And why, when I hear about intentional implementations of ontological gaps, does that sound like just fear. Why does that sound like religioneering? Why does that sound so presumptuous? Why can I not discover the ontological gaps through experience? Why must I intentionally implement absence? It just makes no sense. And when we talk about beginning a religion, and the premise is the obviation of something, immediately I just see problems. I just don't think that the beginning of any religion should be the obviation of a problem. It should be the integration of whatever aspects, but not the obviation. So for instance, when Buddhism steps on the scene, it's like we're going to obviate pain by non-attachment and these other various like protocols. Well, that's the wrong approach. For me, I'm not interested in obviating pain. Like we have to think to the beginning, like, why do we want to re-implement religion? Because of a meaning crisis? Okay, well then what is so, what about the meaning crisis makes us want to return to religion? Clearly, we're calling it a crisis, which indicates that we have some sense of fear and panic. Maybe we need to look at that fear and panic and understand what about ourselves is responding to this as a crisis. And instead of trying to heal it and solve it and implement gaps and create the fuck, I'm not interested in that, man. I want to live. I want to discover where the gaps are. I don't want to be like, yeah, there's a gap and I don't go there because that's my gap. I want to exceed my boundaries and then discover my absences. And for me, that's the religion of experience. And these sort of intentionalized protocols and cordonings and boundaried sort of blueprints are the problem to begin with. And they're always going to be viewed as intentionalized prohibitions. The only prohibition we really need to be thinking about, and this again, like, of course, my belief in why we're afraid of the meaning crisis, why we want to obviate pain, is because it all comes back to a fear, and that fear always drives itself back to death if we really look at it. And so the real prohibition is death itself, or I should say the prohibition on immortality. And then we need to tarry with that before we get to anything else. You know, our religion needs to be death. And that confrontation, that relationship, and anything else before getting to that, solving a crisis, doing this, all this Band-Aid work, like, it's just, it's not fundamental enough to be interesting to me.
No, I think that's a magnificent comment, because arguably what is called the meaning crisis is a result of precisely doing these religions that can't do what people want them to do. So if you go back to them, that doesn't address the crisis. That's just recreating the conditions that make this thing, quote unquote, called the crisis. And that's why I'm really interested in like the hip hop cipher, because what's so interesting about that is you have to face your anxiety. You have to step into this space where you don't know what's going to happen. You're not necessarily creating a condition to fight the anxiety, because you have to like step in and who knows what you're going to say, but you also have conditioned yourself. This is what I think is important. This is why I talk about conditionalism, which I know Mr. Bard said was relativism, but for me, conditionalism is a big part of this, because this whole solving the meaning crisis by reinstituting an institution or something like that, well, that's what got you there, arguably, because the institution, sure, maybe it had some sort of step in a historic process, blah, 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 but clearly there is some sort of lack of address that is giving by. Well, conditionalism for me, when we think about it, like with a cipher, you have to condition yourself to be able to step into the hip hop cipher, to participate in that flow where you actually, oh man, the fact that I face that anxiety, the fact that I did that work, the fact that I don't know what's going to happen, that's what's able to create this condition that is so powerful. But all it is a bunch, people standing in a circle. You don't need, this elaborate economic plan or whatever, right? But that requires conditioning yourself and meeting the conditions of being with other people who are also willing to face their anxiety and to step into that cipher and to see what happens, which to me is a kind of facing of death, because you might screw up. You might be humiliated. And so there's death in that. So I'm really interested in the cipher, which I think some of these kind of, Bernard and I would talk about how like conversations like this that are now called dialogus, back in like, I guess, 2012, it wasn't dialogus. There's something cipher-esque about it. It's not the same. I don't want to say it's the same. Guy Senstock will talk about circling. There's something going on there, but there's something about that sort of willingness to step into. And then you've also spoken very well on the importance of transience and how when you're not willing to embrace transience, you lose a lot. Well, the cipher has a transient element to it because you step in and that's the only cipher that will ever be that cipher, precisely because so much of it is off the dome, and then you let it go and then it has died. So for me, I think you're exactly right. When we think about this question of the moment, the now, the historic moment and what it means to address it, I think it is extremely important. That's why I guess in the piece, Mr. Ebert, on the meaning crisis as a sign of hope, I really want to stress that the meaning crisis is almost dangerous to call it a crisis, because basically we're here because we refuse to use previous ways of finding meaning, because we saw that it led to racism, or it led to nationalism, or it led to violence. We know how to solve, this is my point in that piece, we actually know how to solve the meaning crisis. Racism, nationalism, tribalism, close-mindedness, we know how to solve it. We could solve it right now. But instead, we're more like a Thomas More, in that he refuses to give the king the divorce, and so he gets executed, right? He holds himself to a higher standard, knowing how he could leave the prison at any point, but he imposes a higher standard on himself because he's not going to do that. Well, likewise, we have to see our response to the meaning crisis. It must be in the spirit of holding ourselves to a higher standard, not going back to something, because that's folding the cards. That's where you're not seeing the hope in the meaning crisis. So I think I think the point you're bringing, that it's really, really important to frame it in that way.
And I would just to finish that up with push that a little further, I think the meaning crisis is great, not just a sign of hope to be fixed. I think it's actually wonderful. I think that we have to embrace dissolution and the idea of like, oh, how do we fix it? And we're going to do this. And this is the best thing that's ever fucking happened. It needs to dissolve itself. It needs to go into full blown flux. And we're not even halfway through it. It needs to continue. It needs to get worse. But to me, it's getting better. When I grew up as a kid, all I ever said was, God damn it, I wish these fucking sheep would wake up and question things. And now they are. And now I'm upset about it, right? Now suddenly I'm like, they're questioning things the wrong way. They're kind of stupid. Now it's QAnon. But now I have to take a look back and be like, what was I praying for?
Right.
Let's remember when everything was organized, when I was a kid, and everything was like, you do this and do that, and da, 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 and nobody was questioning anything, The fucking Reagan years. I mean, there was people questioning, but it was like, you guys got to remember what it was like. It was much worse than this, and people are fucking loose cannons right now, but that needs to happen. And so this doesn't need to heal itself. This needs to continue to dissolve. And then, through the excess activity of this dissolution, things will form. And I tell you what, the things that will form are going to be things that I'm going to want to break.
Right.
So no matter what we come up with, a religion that's a religion that's a religion, the sublation of the sublate, every one of these things is dead in the water. Now we're going to try and access it anyway, and we're going to try and get there anyway, because it may be a frozen state that's slightly better than the previous one. But as soon as we get to that frozen moment, everyone's going to be like, you know what, this is boring and stupid, and this is suppressing me.
Right.
Let's break it, let's blow it up again. And that process will start again. So that's the absolute knowing, is understanding that the entire process has no destination and that this is to be embraced.
No, I think that's very, very good. And I'll just add to that before giving it to Javier and Dimitri. It's funny you bring that. It's too bad Mr. Luber left. We just spoke the other evening about the need of, instead of talking about the meaning crisis, almost talk about the meaning story. And what I mean by that is you have the rising action, a story has rising action, incident, inciting incident, climax, and then kind of resolution. And you see, when we talk about a meaning crisis, I think when you think about it as a meaning story, which is you've had this kind of rising action of these ways of religion and philosophy of creating meaning, but then you get an inciting incident where you realize, oh, it makes everyone closed-minded. Oh, it creates religion. Oh, it has totalitarianism. And now you're at the kind of climax point, which is always in a story constituted by a kind of crisis, but it's actually kind of the peak of the story, where you make a huge choice. You make a choice, right? Climaxes have a choice. And now what we're having to do, it's more like the meaning climax than the meaning crisis, if you will. And we have to make a choice on, are we going to go back? It's like Darth Vader telling Luke, you want to join the Empire, and Luke being like, no. Well, then how are you going to beat the Empire, Luke? Well, we're going to make it frickin' work. And so you're at this kind of choice where it's the question of how do we embrace exactly what you described? It would seem like a big part of choosing this moment or making the right choice, if you will, is somehow integrating with what you just said, like actually integrating and accepting that very process. And that coming in this point in history, you're aware that that's what you need to do. And now you have the choice of either blindly pretending like you didn't learn that and going back to old things, or choosing to condition yourself, to use my language, to handle that knowledge and to live according to that knowledge. So I think it's very important to frame the current moment not as oh crap, like the metaphor. I hate the metaphor, because the metaphor of the meaning crisis sounds like we stumbled into a dark alley and like, oh crap, what do? We don't know where we're going. And so it sounds like we are dumb, like we took a wrong turn somewhere. I think that metaphor is so problematic. But if instead we say no, it's more like Luke Skywalker refusing Darth Vader and saying, I'm going to hold this, I'm going to figure out how to make this work. Well, then that changes the entire way you think about it. And I think it's so important to have that change, or else we're just going to join the Empire. Otherwise we're going to just fall back.
And I just want to say one last thing to add on to that very quickly. The worst part about the meaning crisis to me is actually not the crisis bit. It's the prioritizing, or the sort of the primacy of meaning itself. Because if we prioritize meaning, and meaning is what we're after, then the protocol to access that meaning becomes irrelevant. It could be anything.
Right.
The meaning is the end.
That's
Instead, we have to make meaning incidental to experience.
Absolutely. No, I think that's really good. I'll just add to that. The moment you say, I'm going to go have meaning, you're screwed. That's like saying, it's like you say, today I'm going to have a good conversation. The conversation's doomed. I'm going to do a good job in the Cypher. It's doomed. It has to be secondary. So I think you're exactly right that language says, okay, how do I get, you can get meaning from a dictionary. Just go open up the OED and pick a word. You can get all the meaning you want. So it has to be incidental, but that means it's a deeper thing. But I'll give it to Javier and Dimitri. Thank you, Mr. Ebert.
Well, I'm really appreciating Ebert's comments here, because, this is something, a lot of sentiments I share myself. Some of the ringing tones that constantly come up, right, that are very important to always acknowledge, that it seems like we always kind of all agree on, is 1, relation, and 2, choice. It seems like having relation and choice seems to be like the most important factors, mainly because, like Ebert said, right, the moment you get this state of like frozenness, right, you're actually not having a relation. It's a fucking dead thing. It's dead. It's gone, right? So that's the funny thing about having the concept of God, the concept of transience. The moment you sort of solidify any of that thing, you instantaneously stop having a relation to it. And then that means you also stop having choices. You're no longer making choices. You're just you're already dead, in my opinion. I mean, sure, at this point, you're just waiting for your body to decompose. But in talking about transience, right, to sort of bring up the Nietzschean point, right, it would be, what is sort of death for you, right? Like, when I think about this group, death for me would actually be to not think, right? To simply just accept everything that is without questioning it, right? That would be death for me, really, right? So I'd have to just sit there and just, not mentioning Buber, that would be death, right? Someone tells me Buber's wrong, I would disagree, right? But if I really want to accept death, I would just have to just be like, yeah, you're right, Buber's wrong. But I think this is some of the issues. Is not only death is absolutely very important, but it's by bringing in Daniel's notion of conditionality, you have to think, what is death for you? Because it does seem for a lot of people, the escape for religion, I would say actually death for them would be put them in a religion, right? Just put them in a tradition, make them go there, be there, right? That would be death for them. And the other thing, right? If you are in a religion, right, just death for you would be to leave that, right? Just, be a wanderer, like you have nothing now, right? That's death for you. And so like all these notions like prohibitions, I mean, this is really the Nietzschean point, in my opinion, when he said in Zarathustra, like, it's not about good and evil as universals. It's about discovering what is your particular good and evil that is sort of necessary for the development of the person and the individual. So it seems like actually the crisis is exactly this, right? If we universalize crisis, it's fucking pointless. What is your particular crisis that only you encounter, whatever that meaning crisis is at the universal. And it does seem like some of us can actually avoid answering that question if we're obsessing over some universal notion of the meaning crisis. Oh, all this stuff's going on, yada, yada, yada. No, what is your actual personal crisis going on? Because I really doubt that it's actually the universal notion of this meaning crisis. I just really doubt that's actually what it is. But ironically, right, if everybody did this, then we would be answering it, right? We would actually be making a choice. We would actually be going through some type of death. I think choice and death are super correlated. I think that's like the issue. And it might even be the case for some people. To make no choice would be the real death for them. So I think it's, when we combine Ebert's notion of death and Daniel's notion of conditionality, we get something very interesting here where it's like, you have to make a choice. You have to discover what your particular transience that you're avoiding is to discover that incidence of meaning, right? Which is funny because, and this is why I brought back relation again, because before somebody means something to you, you sort of just like meet them, and then all of a sudden they mean something to you, over the course of time. So it really is something incidental. It's not something that you just go, oh, this, you don't just pick something out of the fucking woodwork and be like, okay, this person means something to me, right? It's kind of like was it Dostoevsky makes that argument, right? You can't just love humanity. You have to love like a particular person to say that you love humanity, right? Because what you end up having is people that love humanity but don't love people. So again, that's one of the big issues. And going back to what Luber said, unfortunately he's not here, about the ontological design, just to kind of keep the tension going on between, the Kyoto school and some of the notions of Western philosophy, is that, for the Kyoto school, you have this notion of like, actually, the West is too occupied with being, right? Too occupied with being. And even when Hegel talks about nothing, at least for these philosophers, it's always an oppositional nothingness. It's not an absolute nothingness, which is always a problem for them. So their focus is on absolute nothingness, which apparently academia calls me-ontology. And then, we're stuck on, the ontology phase. So, maybe for the West, we need to think more about nothingness, just to switch it up. Stop talking about being. Stop talking about the grammatical subject that cannot become predicate, right? Go the inverse way. Go the predicate that cannot become subject. And this would really, but this is just sort of like my experimental kind of just thinking about this. But yeah.
Before I forget a few things, you mentioned Japan. I had a talk with Daniel Zaruba. I actually think Japan is a very good analysis on people talking about metamodernity, which is a term that means 1,000 things to 1,000 different people, and I'm hesitant to even use it. But I think you actually can see where metamodernity leads if you examine modern Japan. It's a big claim. Hopefully, the Daniel Zaruba talk brings that out. The other thing I just want to add is we were talking about religion at the start in this question of what are is it the preconditions or the practice of which is the good, you're not trying to go back to it, but what is it that even like in history kind of caught people that made them want to join it or want to be part of it, right? Because that seems to be something that you'd want to examine. I think what we all should keep in mind is the extraordinary radicalness of the time, which is very particular. Like, for example, you have Buddha who's, a prince and he's leading, and he leaves it all behind. this very radical particularity. It's not a dogma. It's not necessarily a thing of beliefs, but there's this incredible sort of radical action that an individual is doing that people go, whoa, what's going on there? Like seeing someone in the Cypher who does something really amazing, like, whoa, what's going on there? I want to be part of that Cypher because that guy is really off the dome. Or you have Jesus that's saying, hey, if somebody slaps you on the cheek, turn your other cheek. What the heck? What are you talking about? Or, hey, adopt orphans. We always forget, like when Jesus puts a child on his knee, back then children they're not even like considered humans, basically. Like they're especially if it's a female child, and it probably was a female child. This would have been considered the lowest of the low of the social hierarchy. And Jesus is like, hey, to get into heaven, you got to be like this. This is radicalness. And you see, that is, I think, the edge. You see, what's happened is we're so comfortable now with these teachings that now they're just teachings. But at the time, there's a radicalness, like a radical standing out, like a really sort of going against what the social order is doing that has this bam kind of power to it. And that is, I think, when we're asking the question of what is this conditionalism? What is this trend? What is this like? There's something that needs to have the spirit of that kind of radicalness, which I think would require facing status anxiety. I think it would require facing death if we're using that language. But we need to, the point I'm just making before giving it to Dimitri, if the question is what are the preconditions that arose to religions that were lost in the religion, it seems to have a lot to do with, say, when the plague's going on in Rome, the Christians stay to like heal people. It has a lot to do with sort of the Buddha saying, no, I'm not going to get swept up in material goods or something. It's this radical edge. So then the question would be, what in our current context, this moment, would constitute that level of a kind of radical edge, if you will. Now, that would have to be explored. That would have to be elaborated on. And precisely the reason why going back to religions can be problematic is because that no longer, you're just going back to something that no longer has the same radical edge. It's no longer facing, say, death or static anxiety because people have already done that, or there are groups to tag into. So it loses that kind of fire, that kind of edge. So that's just something I would say seems to be part of the equation, but I will pass it on to Dimitri and then Jason. I'll pass it on.
I've never liked the term meaning crisis. I like the term meaning apocalypse, though, insofar as it gets at a revelation as well as a crisis. So how do we deal with the meaning crisis? Yeah, I don't think just going for some overarching narrative immediately helps anything. I think we have to tarry with the negative and be patient, especially. I think we here can do that. But what's religion? It's a narrative and it's rituals that hold people together. That's something like this is what Alexander Barth said. Freud said religion is mass neuroticism for this reason. But what's neuroticism? Well, it's an individual religion. So there's an inversion there. So yes, yeah, to want to solve negativity by means of religion, and for Freud is a kind of neuroticism. I think that what we have here in the West with the death of God ready at hand, with all the leftovers that we see in Christianity and with philosophy, religion is interesting to think about because it has been a way that we have contained and channeled libidinal flows. And religion, for this reason, is about sexuality, right? It's about what are the kind of sutric containers that you have to facilitate something like a family, or even the problem of skill, Maybe religion could be seen as something that is a way that philosophers have tried to deal with the problem of skill by instantiating their philosophy. So this is where the sutra and tantra divide become interesting, because Javier, you kind of pointed at it, like there's the layman, and we should not desire of him that he become like philosophers. I think it's kind of right to call this a kind of root of totalitarianism, because there is a knowing that they will never become like this anyway, and there's a kind of hubris in this. But to have a tantra and sutra divide your own thinking when it comes down to religion. I think it's a constructive way of looking at how do we contain those real libidinal flows. And recently I've been watching some Mussolini speeches and reading about Mussolini and also about Nazis and things like this. And, you know, there's a huge BDSM scene in Berlin. Why do I say this? Well, because I don't think it's a stretch to say that if you do not contain sexuality in this way with a BDSM scene, you'll basically have a sublimation into the political. That will be a huge catastrophe. So this BDSM scene is a kind of tantric container for those libidinal flows. And you can see it when you see Mussolini's speeches, man, like the way he's standing there in front of a crowd. It's like it's a BDSM play. He's like asking the crowd, do you want any honors? Do you want to win? Do you want a happy life? And they're all screaming, no, we don't want this, we don't want this, we don't want this. And it's fucking obscene as fuck. And it's so sexual. It's such a yearning for submission from those people that they apparently do not have in their sexual life, and they sublimate it in this way, as well as for Mussolini himself. Obviously. So with all that, I do think it's interesting to think about really what is religion, not only theologically, but also how does it instantiate itself in the world, and what does that mean to us that it's ready at hand? What do we do with it now? As this, with all that I've said, you know, amorally, and also with Daniel, what you said, you know, like Christ is such a radical figure. It's really bizarre, actually. Like we're so normalized with the Christian narrative, but even just thinking about the cross, you know, it's a kind of like, imagine going to Western society and you're just seeing this guy, this half-naked guy with blood all over, hanging on a cross. Like you'd be right to say that's obscene and that's totally out of this world. And crazy. Of course, René Girard comes in here as Christ being the very scapegoat. So for these reasons, I do think that it's super interesting to keep thinking about religion, not to like say, oh well, we're special, we're gonna bring the new narrative that's gonna efface the subject and have a totalizing, you know, obviation. So with all that.
Oh no, I mean, the connection between religion and libido energy must be stressed. I mean, arguably, if there was no sex, there'd be no religion. That these things kind of go together in the problem of, you know, in the problem of having children. You know, there are children that exist. And what do you do if they get left behind or if no one takes care of them? There are all these different questions that emerge. But then, of course, the question becomes, okay, well, what from that can you derive on the question of this current moment in the meaning story that would not be going back, but would help you tarry with this moment? I think that's a fair analysis. With that, I will give it to Mr. Jason.
I'd like to touch on what Alex said about meaning and accident. Yeah, I think that's very interesting. You know, of course, meaning without accident is not really meaningful. You know, I agree that purposefully, I'm making scare quotes here, seeking meaning in an artificial way, it's dumb, you know. But perhaps, and maybe here I'm provoking, why pretend like we won't arrive at meaning anyway, right? Isn't meaning, there is an irreducibility in meaning, you know, in that even meaninglessness is also meaningful. I think we can all we all agree here that the point is to think, right? The point is to interpret the world, you know, to even I think we can even say animals read the environment and navigate the environment, you know, in a way the world is meaningful even to them. You know, perhaps meaning is just the ability to produce more interpretation for us to generate more meaning and then to interpret further, you know. And it is what you said, Daniel, and this is resonating with me very much actually, since you spoke about it, ontoepistemology. There is a kind of relationship between being and thinking about being, and this is, you know, you can't just reduce it to one or the other. it's like what Nietzsche said, we have to be able to stand over our own heads. When the grounds disappear, the next step to do is to stand over our own heads. And I think this is like, basically, you have to recognize this. There is an irreducibility to meaning, and then perhaps another provocation, and I'm very open-minded here because this is a hard subject, I think, so by all means, destroy me. Similar to the irreducibility of meaning, Javier mentioned meontology and non-being. Very interesting, fine pursuits, obviously. But again, at the end of the day, are we not bringing these very things into being? Like, there is a kind of dialectic, and perhaps here I am too Western or Eurocentric, but again, onto epistemology, there is a kind of dialectical relationship that is hard to think outside of, like we're always in it, right? And yeah, I mean, so again, like to underline that very quickly, perhaps why pretend that the point is not meaning?
Just to that last bit that Jason brought up, I think the point, I would not say that meaning is irreducible. I would say that it's unavoidable, but there's a contingency there which relates to time. So, for instance, one of the big arguments I would have with Bard's, sidekick, Alexander Elan, would be that without difference, without ontological gaps, meaning would evaporate. And so you must have difference because, and I'd say why? And he'd say, because otherwise there is no meaning. Well, that's not a good argument. What does that even mean? Like, because otherwise there's no meaning, what is that? Like, meaning is not so fundamental that we cannot consider things that actually do occur, like equilibriums. In equilibriums, energetic equilibriums, or any other kind of equilibrium, there is no difference internally. In fact, that's the whole point of sublation. The internal condition of the sublated moment is an infinite self-relation. That is an equilibrium, as Hegel says himself and uses that word. So in the state of the infinite now, as Bard calls it, where we have a dissolution of relation, or as someone said the other day, as Trungpa calls shunyata, saying it is an excess of claustrophobia, total claustrophobia. Well, what is claustrophobia? It's a density of relation to the point where absence occurs. And that's my whole point with excess entailing absence. Now, when we have so much relation that suddenly you cannot any longer differentiate from one particular thing to another, you have a disappearance of relation. And if you have a disappearance of relation, you no longer have difference. And in that state of indifference, you have the dissolution of meaning. But suddenly someone like Elon cannot consider that, because that would mean there would be no meaning. And so suddenly there's an ontological gap set as an intentionalized boundary beyond which we cannot even consider something like an infinite or a total saturation or a total claustrophobia, which dissolves relation. So yes, it's meaning is unavoidable, but I would almost like to say meaning is unavoidable post hoc or retroactively, in memory, in reflection, but in the moment, it is not necessarily fundamental if what we mean by meaning is observing difference.
Absolutely, and I just very quickly, I'm so sad I have to leave this very second. I think when I said irreducible, I guess I wasn't saying that meaning is fundamental. I agree with you, like that there is a kind of co-primitivism, let's say, between meaning and difference and something like, and perhaps I'm wrong here in interpreting it, but I think this is what you mean by equilibrium, like it is unavoidable post hoc. That part I agree with you totally. And unfortunately I have to run right now. Sorry guys.
Thank you for being here, Jason. I will give it, thank you, Alex, for that. Excellent. And I'll give it to Javier.
Yeah, actually, Alex touched upon touched upon one of the things that I was really trying to emphasize on the idea of nothingness, right? Like absolute nothingness. I think this is probably one of the most misinterpreted ideas in the West, right? Nothingness is always taken as like some type of deprivation. Rather, really, absolute nothingness is like, it's such an undifferentiation that you can't even distinguish anything. It's such an excess, you know, it's such an excess. And I think, you know, almost like encountering this excess or realizing this, coming to realize this excess, right, is actually the death itself. Where you're just so claustrophobic, you're like, oh my God, I can't even, like, who am I? Who am I? You know, so claustrophobic, you can't even say, who am I anymore? And yet, ironically, I think this is also kind of like what gives meaning, right? If we talk about like this, you know, I think meaning obviously has to go through some type of transience in order to actually be meaningful. This sort of oscillation, if not, then, you know, what's the point? It does seem like, you know, often when people want some type of meaning, they are trying to answer some type of transience that's coming, right? But I think they sort of interpret that the wrong way. You know, they use meaning as some type of avoidance, right? Rather, meaning should be connected to the transience itself. But yeah, I think really Ebert kind of hit on like a lot of topics I was going to bring up anyways. Because yeah, excess, and then yeah, difference still doesn't get, and that was a good point, Ebert. Like difference still doesn't get at, you know, meaning and so on. Which is why I feel like stressing the point of, you know, absolute nothingness as this sort of access, you know, excess in itself, such a claustrophobic, that's actually a good term to use as. But yeah, I'll just stop there.
Well, magnificent. You know, a few things come to mind. I wonder the origins of the phrase, the meaning crisis. I believe that, you know, that comes from Dr. Vervaeke. You know, when you ask a lot of people, you know, who are, because we have to realize that the origin of this phrase is very much tied to the mental health crisis, right? We have a lot of people that are suffering depression, anxiety, and different mental health issues. And a lot of times when you ask these people, you know, what's wrong, they'll say, you know, what's the point? They will use a language of, I don't feel like doing anything. What's the point? And so on and so forth. So that creates the impression that the issue is that they do not have meaning. Personally, though, I've never encountered anyone who would say walking down the sidewalk, going to get something to eat, and then they stop and go, oh my gosh, I don't have meaning in my life, and then stopping what they're doing, right? You know, the realization that you don't have meaning or meaning is not like an active thought. I did not, before I entered this net conversation, say, I'm going to do the net conversation because I find it meaningful. You know, retrospectively, you say, oh, that was a meaningful conversation. Oh, it's meaningful to gather these people together. It matters to me, but it is not the initial driver of different things. However, if I never did net conversations, or I never did the OG Rose or I did anything, I might, you know, if I was just going to the wedding venue day in and day out, just kind of making your paycheck or whatever, I may just kind of say, there's no point to anything, right? And he would say my life did not have meaning. But you see, what's very important is that it's the doing of something that then retrospectively you say, oh, that has meaning to me, that is actually primary, the doing of something. I had a conversation with John Trossi and Lorenzo, both of who I adore, and we talk a lot about kind of investment. Now, I'm going to use this metaphor, and I'm not saying everyone needs to go to Wall Street, but it's just a very useful model. You see, when you invest something, there's risk. You could lose all your money. You think it's a good idea, but then, you know, the GameStop dropped from $500 a share to $20, not such a good idea. But there's something about investment that requires risk. It requires discernment. It requires you might lose, because you do this. And how it's really, what we talked about is how that kind of metaphor of thinking of ideas in life in terms of investment can be very, very useful, because in like the stock market, what they'll say is without risk, you can't create value, right? Like there has to be risk. There has to be putting your skin in the game, right? And that's where it comes from. Well, what Lorenzo will talk about is kind of financial epistemology. And again, this is just all a metaphor. And basically what we have to do is think about ideas and actions in terms of, risk and the value that can come from those risks. And the reason why I bring all this up is because in my experience, say working at Eunoia or different people that would come through, a lot of people that were dealing with, say, they felt like their life didn't have meaning. They also had an incident where, say, they felt trapped at work, or they had a family member that was putting pressure on them to do something they didn't want to do, or they felt like something happened to them where they felt trapped. Well, to get me, before this pressure, this kind of social pressure, they were going about their life just fine. They were doing things, they were doing what they want to do, but something occurred that made them feel stuck, like they were in a certain script, a certain sort of like zeitgeist that they had to ascribe to. Well, that would mean that the way you overcome that is facing that, or standing up to your parents and saying, no, I'm not going to do, say, this thing that makes you happy. I'm going to do this thing that I'm not going to conform to that, right? Well, there's a risk in that. And also you have to kind of take a stand on what you believe that you should be doing to stand up against those different pressures. And you'd be amazed how many people, it's very difficult to do this, of course, but how people who did this in our experience would then, quote unquote, have meaning. But notice what came first. It was not a sitting down and going, what do I find meaningful in life, and thinking about it and then living that out. What it was facing something. That was primary. Taking a risk, that was primary. Some sort of courageous act, that was primary. And then after that is done, a lot of the mental health issues could get better. Now, of course, I'm not saying that's always the solution to every mental health issue. But you see, if we think of the mental health crisis as exclusively being a matter of a lack of meaning, well, then we can just carry out giving people the right ideas and we think that's going to help them. Well, ideas are lenses by which we operate, so ideas matter, but ideas in themselves that do not lead to courage or action or risk or investment are not going to be what needs to be done. If Luke Skywalker, when Darth Vader asks him to join the Empire, says, my heart is with the rebels, and just thinks that and doesn't do anything that might get him killed by Darth Vader, that's not a very good climax, right? And you're not going to get any of the resolution action, or you're not going to move to the next state. There has to be the action. So for me, what's important, I think, is what we're, when the problem with the meaning crisis can be the emphasis on the finding of meaning versus the taking that risk, the having that courage, taking that stand, facing that anxiety, stepping into something. And then if you have that as your metric, then of course it becomes the training or the preparing to, say, stand up to your parents, or to leave the job that you think if you leave, you're going to lose everything, or to do that thing that you think people are going to make fun of you for doing. And then the question becomes how you condition yourself to be the person that can do that thing. And then if you do it, 2 years go by and you look back and you go, oh, I guess my life does have meaning, because you went through that thing. But it has to come, I think, after that courage. And so then that's where putting the emphasis on that kind of thing, the taking the stand, what I like to call the real choice, the going forth, that is what's primary. And then if we go back to the question before passing it to Dimitri, and then again, if anyone has final things to say, please. When I go back and I look at, the precondition of religion that has been lost in religion, is this sort of like Jesus saying, hey, I'm going to stand up against the Roman Empire. Hey, there's this kind of risk that's going to be taken that can get us all killed. Hey, I'm going to say that little girls have humanity and personhood, even if the entire social order says they don't. And that kind of courage and risk seems to be kind of the precondition or the source of religion that we want to kind of capture. That seems to be what's at the root, not the institution itself, because I think there could be an emphasis on institution, but that kind of courage. I associate this with courage and real choice, but I'll give it to Dimitri.
That's really beautifully put. And I totally agree, because, doing my projects, doing the tantric things that I did and writing about it, like, you know, I've lost people who I thought were friends, and I've lost contact with certain family members because they think it's disgusting and purely immoral. Now, I would do it again, and then again and again if I could do it again, because I'm not willing to sacrifice this in me. And yeah, it's really stunning what you said, because that's I'm researching for the Nietzsche paper I'm doing right now, and he says that courage is the best killer. That's what Nietzsche says in Zarathustra, and I thought that was really amazing. But there is this kind of thing that, you know, I'm trying to, how do you bridge the gap between you as a natural child to becoming a spirit child, which is, you know, Zarathustra's last metamorphosis. And between that, you do need the camel and the lion. And the lion, of course, is this figure that's courageous and is there to go out in the world and destroy in its path what it doesn't want to have in its path. But the problem with the lion is that it cannot be a self-turning wheel. So there is this kind of breakthrough. There's a kind of, this is not enough and this is not who I am, so I'm going on my own path and clear the space for my own freedom because I want this. But the spirit child as this self-turning wheel, Zarathustra also calls it a game. He says it's a kind of game. And then when you read Hegel, he says the same thing about the absolute idea. He says the absolute idea is the game of distinguishing itself and then overcoming the distinguishing. So there's this thing to it that, you know, like, okay, meaning crisis, that, I mean, the fact that people talk about this means that they feel rootless. They don't feel grounded. They don't feel at home. That's why they are trying to do, whether it's trying to get ideas or do actions or getting ideas and do actions according to that. But there, yeah, I mean, I think this is a super complex topic when you get through like what's the end game of Hegel and Nietzsche and this, because there's also this idea of this self-turning wheel of like turning desire into drive. So like Daniel, like to put it more concretely, what you said, not as a thing that happens once, but is your very drive as a being that, you know, can, and of which its access can never be contained in any institution, actually. Like those are the people who create institutions in some sense. You know, if you look at Alexa Vartman, for example, who started the TNT, like is a super excessive kind of human being, you know, she cannot be contained by anything. That's why she created her own world, like the spirit child does, you know, the worldless one creating the own world. But then always in the dialectic of history, there is this kind of failure and even a kind of necessary betrayal. So if you look at Gurdjieff, for example, Gurdjieff wrote this book. What was it? Now I lost the title. It was something about blah, 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 blah to the grandson. And what Gurdjieff wanted to say to this, say about this is that actually the first generation after me will not understand me. So I will write this book to the generation which comes after that generation. And I think it's also relevant for this conversation with how, you know, the concrete universal of religion.
I just wanted to add a couple things. One was something about, oh, Daniel, you had mentioned gambling, essentially all of that, like the risk and all of that. This. What I see, you know, to Dimitri saying, you know, what I see is people with much more meaning now than they had, if what we mean by meaning is the sort of meaning that you get from a struggle cluster, which is generally religious sort of meaning. So you have anti-vaxxers, pro-vaxxers, you have QAnon, you have anti-QAnon, you have then philosophers who are looking at all and saying, you know what, this is a meaning crisis. This is now my struggle. My call to action has been instigated, and now this is my meaning. And the struggle that I'm struggling against is this meaning crisis. Meanwhile, the meaning crisis is more this sort of like totalized analysis of too much meaning. everyone having little pockets of meaning and whatnot. But when I've never seen so many people so embedded in various struggle clusters and finding so much meaning within them. Whether it's, being trans or being a they, and then moving from they to a this thing, and that from a this thing. And then it's just everything. It's just constantly looking for the next horizon of struggle. And what it really is, in some ways, is oppression, compulsion, which I actually wrote a whole essay about, where we're really compulsed to find the next oppression because we don't have extant, pre-existing, prohibitionary sort of state levied oppressions so much anymore. So instead we have to make them. So when I was a kid, I grew up upper middle class, and so I manifested, what did I call it? I manufactured my hardship, right? Because I didn't have any. So I was like, how do I get some hardship going? Oh, I'll become a heroin addict. I had to figure out ways to struggle so that I could find meaning. Otherwise, I just felt like I was living this listless, comfortable bullshit life. And then I just wanted to point on something that I think, Dimitri said she's uncontained. Totally I've never seen any. As soon as you have, and when we're talking about religion, what religion is in many ways is just a symbol. It is like a constellation of symbols into which we sort of put our energy. Those symbols, as soon as you have TNT, you create that name, that's your boundary. You already are boundaried.
Yes,
as soon as you put our name on it.
But she is not in the TNT anymore.
Exactly. And why isn't she?
The whole point. She cannot be contained by any structure. She's doing her own thing.
No, she was contained by it, and that's why she had to leave, because she experienced the death of the container. Once you reach the excess, you can only reach that excess within the container. She wouldn't have left if it wasn't limited, but she felt the limit and she had to leave. All I'm saying is that she was contained and left. What you're suggesting is she felt no containment. If she felt no containment, she wouldn't have left. What I'm saying is that as soon as you create the container, the reason to leave is when you feel the containment. And what I'm saying, and that's the moment of sublation, a thing that defines one person from another in some sense is how sensitive we are to that containment and how quickly we're willing to move on from containment. But I would reject the idea that she did not feel the containment. I think the reason she would leave, or the reason I've left projects, is because you get to that saturated excess and you're like, oh my God, I'm dead, I move. And so you have to move. So like, she was contained, but she moved on, is what I'm saying.
Well, just to respond to that, what happened to the TNT with when Alexa Fartman left wasn't just some kind of abstract thing. Like there were real things going on with other people, and I mean, I wouldn't.
I don't know her. I don't know her situation at all. I'm just expressing that
there's a certain history there. It's not.
Sure. But I'm saying, in the context of you saying she could not be contained, she clearly came. Usually when you leave something, you come up against some kind of limit, and it might have been a relational limit. She might have felt imposition. I don't know what her situation was, but I'm just saying that the reason we tend to move on from something, and this goes back to the conversations we were having on IDW that I was talking to Owen about, are actually because we come up against limits. And what we generally call that is success, or some sort of arrival state that feels constraining, that we have to move on from. And it's, again, this claustrophobia of relation. Now, I don't know what the case was with her, but I just wanted to state in general that the idea that someone cannot be contained, I think, negates a certain operation that is inherent to becoming and being, and the whole process of transcending things, is that we do feel contained, which is why we move on. That's all. Otherwise, we simply wouldn't. There would be no leaving of anything.
Wait, it's just to prevent a miscommunication. So,
okay.
My point was that, I mean, I guess since we're all here, we're probably all kind of excessive, and we all feel like we don't fit in with a normative society in some way or another, and yes, you can force. There is a way in which you can force yourself to go into that, and stay within those confines, but then it's like you're killing yourself, or it's even worse because you're like killing really who you are while you live. So I think we basically agree there that yes, you know you can force yourself to be a slave and go into complete repression, but then what matters life anyway, if that's what comes up.
Yeah, no, I guess yeah, then we totally agree. I thought that you were saying something else, but it's relevant to just the point that something that I feel in my own life, as soon as I give anything a name, philosophy portal, Edward Sharpe and the Magnetic Zeros. Oh, we're together now. You're my girlfriend. Any of these things, you create the container, it's so powerful. As soon as you create that boundary, get ready to experience the excess pressing against that boundary, the saturation occur, and the entire relation of your relation to it to disintegrate and to dissolve into this total claustrophobia. And then it's about negotiating, and it's not, in the case of a relationship, I'm actually finding it's really interesting to stay in it. At first I was like, I get the fuck out, but actually staying in that excess has its own benefits that are interesting as well. But there is a death that occurs. So the dissolution of something continues to happen against that limit. Yeah, anyway.
That was really well put. I'll give it to Javier. Jason, good to see you again. It's interesting. It makes me think of the problem of definition, which is once I name an organization, there's a part where you go, oh, this is great because now we know what we're doing and I have something to expand into. But then you hit the walls and you're like, crap, now I want to leave the definition. And to me, I think of this in the sociological problem of givens, which is when you have givens, you have direction, givens like axiomatic givens, and like society, like if you're born in an Islamic society, it's given that you have certain rituals and processes you do. And this is great. It's like, oh, I have direction. I know how to use my freedom. But then you go, crap, my freedom is being directed. And so this is why, for me, another reason why, and I'll just pass it on to Javier, another reason why a problem, it's an entirely different subject that I hesitate to bring up. I'm extremely critical of any sociology that is not tragic. And what I mean by tragic is a trade-off of competing goods. I would have to explain what I mean by that. It would get me into Philip Reef, belonging again, and different things like that. But I think you're pointing at that very well, Mr. Ebert. Like in society, we want definition. We want to be part of something, but that precisely creates the conditions that we bump up against and then want to leave it. And so, but that has to be part of your sociological theory, that very movement, that very tragedy, if you will. And tragedy does not mean catastrophe. That's been a big problem in the West. That's why we don't understand Greek literature very well. Tragedy is a situation when you have to choose between competing goods. And how do you choose one? And it's very conditional and very situated. It is not a catastrophe. In fact, I would say, I meant to tell you this earlier, Dimitri, the meaning apocalypse, that's pretty good. The revelation and so likewise, if we called it like the meaning tragedy or something, that would be getting closer, but crisis puts it completely on the side of we screwed up, as opposed to maybe we're just, like you said, Mr. Ebert, hitting the limits of definition and we need to leave that container behind that. But we don't even have that as a category of thought because of the language we use for the meaning crisis. And then also, I don't think we have a tragic sociology. And I also think we've lost the category of tragedy that Martha Nussbaum. But let me give it to Javier on that.
Well, I think Ebert made such a good point about relationships, wanting to stay in a relationship, because actually in personal relationships, you actually have a very good example of how containers sort of oscillate. For example, I meet somebody, I learn their name, right? Let's say like Daniela. But as soon as I get closer to her, I meet that container and I say, you know what, Daniela, you are my honey boo bear, right? So you start changing the name because you're running against that limit of that. It no longer wants to be Daniela. You want it to be honey boo bear now, right? But it's funny, right? The moment you get angry, you go, Daniela Gardner, or something like that. I'm pretty sure you have a cousin named Daniela Gardner. He's like, wow. But anyways, right? You start like oscillating these limits. And I think that's actually why staying in a relationship is actually a good thing, because, and I brought this actually with my conversation with Daniel Barnes. Wow, I'm really combining names here. Anyways, yeah. I mean, I know Barnes visited you, so maybe I'm just associating. Anyways, Samuel Barnes. I had a conversation with Samuel Barnes when he visited me, and I said, you know, what's fascinating about when you have like a relationship with your father and mother, right? You typically confine ourselves to the actual definition of father and motherhood. But what's interesting is that the way I overcame my sort of disappointment with my own father is actually I dropped the container, right?
Same.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. What did you start calling him?
I basically just started, I said, why stop looking at him as dad? Because clearly there was a point in time where he wasn't dad, and just meet that, cultivate a relationship with that. And then you can actually rework a new category of father because you have now encountered a new container and you go back and forth. But yeah, that's kind of like how I dropped it. I dropped the category of dad because obviously dad doesn't encompass this being that I'm meeting right here, right now. But yeah, that's my main point.
In Judaism, there's this notion that you can't say God's name, right? Like Yahweh, you're not supposed to say it. We have to remember, like, what that does is it's supposed to force you to go back on all the other names of God, like the lily of the valley, or the red, like there's all these other names in the Torah, and then you can get into Christian, the lamb. And you're supposed to kind of cycle through these metaphors, think one to the extreme, and then once you can move on to the lily of the valley, think one to the extreme and move on. That would be another characteristic. We're talking about the precondition of religion, or a characteristic of religion that is good to keep in mind, is precisely this cycling through metaphors and different titles. So you're constantly destabilized. And arguably, once you lose that, it becomes a problem, because then you call God God. And then, that just becomes your own projection. Then it becomes Feuerbachian and different things like that. And that becomes a big problem. I think, again, I've appreciated this conversation so much. I hate to run and go to the mechanic. It's really quite terrible. But right here, I think, like, that very skill right there that was just described on the ability to be the kind of person that can drop a container or move into a container till you hit the limits, and then have the skill and condition to move to another container, or say, okay, I'm hitting the limits, but actually I'm learning something in this container. So let me see if I can find a way to be comfortable with the uncomfortableness I feel hitting that limit until I learn what I need to learn and then move on. That's all going to be particular to your situation. That is not captured in the meaning crisis language. That kind of skill, that kind of habituation. When we talk about the meaning crisis, the problem can be just find meaning. Well, what does that mean? What does it mean to find meaning? When you start talking about a skill of bumping up against limits and kind of being able to leave a container, I think that's great, Mystery, because that's a kind of courage. That's a kind of risk to go outside the container. To be undefined is terrifying. But you see, the reason why the language of meaning crisis can be so terrible is because precisely someone can go, oh, I don't fit into anywhere, therefore, who am I? Therefore, my life doesn't have meaning. That might precisely be evidence that your life does have meaning. The very fact that you don't fit in anywhere, or that you can't find a container in which to belong, may not be evidence that you don't have meaning. It precisely could be evidence that you have an incredible amount of meaning. But by thinking you need meaning as primary, you can retrograde. You can devolve yourself by shrinking yourself into a container. Now, maybe you need to find a container, but if that kind of nuance is not even part of your mental model, you're in trouble. And that's where I think you can see a certain deficiency in the conversation about the meaning crisis. And that's why, for me, it's so important to get into topics like particular skills, courage, risk, real choice, all of these different things of which then meaning is secondary. Because if meaning is primary, you may think you do not have meaning in your life precisely when you meet the condition of being someone who is like a supersaturated phenomenon, to use that language before from Marriott that I like so much. So it's really, really important. The last thing I'll say, and I think Mr. Eber put this very well, when we talk about the meaning crisis, that can make it sound like it's a logos crisis. Like it's a crisis of like not having the right ideas, right? It kind of frames it as, oh, primarily logos. But you see, if we follow something, Bard will always talk about the mythos, pathos, logos. There's actually a tradition of like a tripartite soul. I think it's eros, logos, and thymos are the three. And basically kind of the notion is if you don't have all three, you're in big trouble. Like if you have thymos, but you don't have logos, then you're like toxic masculinity. But if you have logos and eros, but you don't have thymos, then you can just be the last man in Nietzsche. And if you have, you got to have them all, right? So if you just call it a meaning crisis, you can make it sound like, oh, the problem is we don't have logos. We have the other two, but we don't have logos. No. It seems like we have a whole lot of logos. We have a whole lot of thinking. We have a whole lot of that. That doesn't seem to be the primary deficiency. And this is where I like Raymond's work, because he'll talk more about thymos. Now, the danger with thymos is that can be a toxic masculinity, but that's where you get the risk, the courage, the being able to step outside of a container, the willing to face different things. And if we think of the meaning crisis as having maybe some characteristics of a thymotic element, that can make a different thing. And then the last thing I want to say to your point, Mr. Ebert, I think it's very important to realize that there are lots of, say, people falling into conspiracy theories or political movements, or I guess the new one is trad or whatever. That's a conservative version of wokeness or whatever. You know, there's these different things where people are finding meaning. Well, that means, you know, when we call it a meaning crisis, quote unquote, what seems to be going on is people are saying that the way people are finding meanings is falling back on old standards. They're falling back on old ways of belonging and creating givens and closed-mindedness, and that's problematic. Well, that's important to note, though, because you're saying the crisis is not that there's a lack of meaning, but that the way, it's either that people don't know how to create meaning, or there's a way that people are creating meaning that is problematic. Well, wait a minute now. That means we're talking about a certain ordering, a certain way of being, a certain way of carrying ourselves, a certain way of acting that needs to be brought out. And that's where bringing up courage, bringing up risk, bringing up coming to be comfortable with not having mission or moving outside of the container, that's what we're primarily talking about. But if you overemphasize the meaning, well, the solution's simple. I'll join a conspiracy. Oh, there's other people over here. They're having it. They have some like movement, and you go and join that. So I think it is so important to see this as the meaning being secondary to something else. And that something else seems to be coming to terms with this oscillation. I think that language you use, Mr. Ebert, is very good. Seeing that is part of it, the thymos, the courage, the risk, the investment, all of this is greatly part of it. So I appreciate that very much. If anyone has any last things to say, please, and then I'll run. I put everyone on the spot, didn't I? Don't you love that? I'm like, yes, it's very good. So I really enjoyed this conversation. I really appreciate the nuancing of it all. And I always appreciate an opportunity to bring up the hip hop Cypher. So thank you for that. That was really great. You know, Bernard and I would always talk about Cypher mentality, like thinking according to the Cypher, and that being a kind of way of life. So I always appreciate it. Mr. Ebert, it's very good to see you, sir. Dimitri, very good to see you. Javier, very good to see you. Jason, good to see you. I will now go hope that the tires were not too expensive, but I hear there's this thing called inflation going on. So we will see how that goes. Thank you all very much for all of this. A true delight. Thank you.